one ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
There are
a traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.
It's code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening. Wildfires, floods, and hurricanes. Extreme climate events warn of impending doom. Is the world heading towards a climate catastrophe? Watch WION's Climate Tracker weekdays at 12 p.m. GMT, 5:30 p.m. IST.
You don't know how to fix the holes in our ozone layer. You don't know how to bring the salmon back up a dead stream. You don't know how to bring back an animal now extinct. And you can't bring back the forest that once grew where there is now a desert.
You have ignored us in the past and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
Show us your faith. Show us your trustworthiness.
Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started. The war in Ukraine has entered its fourth week. Attacks continue, talks continue, and the humanitarian tragedy also continues. This war has overshadowed another war, the one against the Wuhan virus. That too is far from over. The Omicron surge, the so-called milder infections, and the sudden drop in cases a couple of months back may have led to a sense of complacency. We talked about living with the virus, took off the masks, and pretended it was all over. Well, I have news for you. The pandemic is not over. There's another wave in the making. More than 50 million people are locked down in China. Cases are surging in South Korea and Germany. India is holding high-level meetings to tackle what could be a fourth wave. Many in our country and around the world are celebrating the festival of Holi, and the last thing we want is to dampen the celebration, but it is our duty to tell you where things stand. On Gravitas tonight, we'll map the resurgence of the Wuhan virus. Whichever part of the world you're joining us from, watch these reports and stay safe. Would you like to see what panic looks like? Let me show you a video from China.
전쟁 났냐 전쟁 났어 아주. 정신으로 정신없다. 와 이게 뭐.
This is China's Guangzhou. This video is from last week. It was recorded at the China International Beauty Expo. At this expo, tested positive. One person. So Chinese officials did what? They raised an alarm, shut down everything and forced everyone to take a Wuhan virus test. That's why these people were running in panic. Textbook case of what not to do. But this is becoming the norm in China. Day after day, city after city, hundreds if not thousands of people are lining up for tests. The Chinese establishment is overwhelmed by the crowds. They're struggling with Omicron. More than 50 million people are under lockdown. 50 million people in China locked down. The scale of this outbreak is massive. At least 13 cities have shut down. China suddenly feels the need for new hospitals. Look at this. In Jilin, Beijing is trying to build a makeshift hospital with 6,000 beds. In Shanghai, even food delivery is proving to be a challenge. Barriers have been erected outside residential compounds. 17 million people are under lockdown in this city alone. China is already counting its losses. The lockdowns will hurt half of the country's GDP. Exporters are worried about supply chains. Trucks are delayed because the drivers have to take tests. Container rates have spiked, tripled compared to last year. Ships are facing delays at ports, delays of up to 12 hours. That's because China is locking down again. It's 2020 all over again in China. How bad is this outbreak? The worst ever. Worse than what we saw in Wuhan in 2020. This is China's worst Wuhan virus outbreak. On average, the country is reporting more than 2,000 infections every day. But as always, the numbers do not add up. As of Tuesday, 28 out of 31 provinces in China had confirmed cases. The virus has spread to almost all parts of the country, which means the number of cases is bound to be more than what the official data claims. What's worse, Beijing's old pandemic playbook is multiplying the misery. I'm talking about the zero COVID strategy. China has not changed its methods since 2020. So even if there's one suspected case, everyone in the city is tested. China held it up as an example for the world. Well, it's still an example, but now it's an example of what not to do. Zero COVID has had zero success. Let me show you. This is the same convention center in Guangzhou that we just showed you. The one where just one attendee tested positive, just one. I want you to look at the chaos it led to. Thousands of people caged inside a convention center waiting for a negative Wuhan virus test. Is this the best way to handle an outbreak? We all know the answer. As it turned out, all of these people tested negative after so much chaos, panic and pain. The thing is, zero COVID is unscientific and it's causing major suffering. Ask Hong Kong. It has reported the world's highest death rate in this surge, and that's not even the most shocking part of it. What I'm about to show you is disturbing. These pictures went viral last week. This is a hospital in Hong Kong. These bags are not empty. There are human bodies inside, dead. Wuhan virus victims. And they were kept right next to Wuhan virus patients, patients who were on oxygen support and ventilators, and next to them you have body bags. What explains this horror? Too many deaths. Crematoriums in Hong Kong are nearly full. Even the administration cannot deny this. Let me tell you what Hong Kong's chief executive Carrie Lam said. Our crematoriums are working day and night, and they're already close to their capacity. Carrie Lam says she still needs more time to fix the situation.
Time has come for the government to have a midterm review of all those measures announced on the 22nd of February, ranging from border controls, such as flight bans, to quarantine period for arrivals, to whether we are going to do this compulsory universal test, and the resumption of face-to-face learning in schools and social distancing measures. So just give me a little bit of time. When the 1 month period comes, that is around the 20th or 21st of March, I will give a comprehensive update on the situation.
Hong Kong's response to the outbreak has been a disaster. There were growing demands for Carrie Lam's resignation, but Lam, just like her political masters in Beijing, refuses to accept her failures. China depends on two tools to fight the virus. Number one is mass testing and lockdowns. The second is vaccines, Chinese vaccines. The first one is not practical, mass testing and lockdowns. The second one does not work, Chinese vaccines. Now, China may not admit to this, but it has failed to contain its homegrown virus, and now it is struggling to treat its patients. This week, China gave emergency use authorization to Pfizer's antiviral pill. It is called Paxlovid. It is one of the few available drugs to treat the Wuhan virus. Wasn't China working on its own antiviral pills? It's like the Chinese vaccine story. The pills don't work, so China has been forced to swallow its pride and accept foreign pills instead. And it's not just China. Wuhan virus cases are rising all over the world. First, the numbers. 11 million new cases were reported last week. That's an 8% jump from the week before. How many deaths? More than 43,000. Like we keep saying, we may be done with the virus, but the virus is not done with us. There is no epicenter for this outbreak. The numbers are rising almost everywhere. Take a look at the Western Pacific. This includes countries like Australia, China, South Korea and Japan. Cases have risen 25% there and deaths have risen by 27%. South Korea is the worst hit. On Thursday, they reported more than 600,000 cases in a day. 600,000. That's a 55% increase from Wednesday. Also, their highest daily caseload since the pandemic began. The daily deaths also hit a national record, 429 deaths in just 24 hours. In Africa, cases have risen by 12% and deaths have gone up by 14%. Europe's data is interesting. Cases rising by 2%, but deaths are still at the same levels. The reason? Vaccines. Europe hoarded millions of vaccines last year. They gave boosters and double boosters. Around 75% of Europe is fully vaccinated. Compare that to Africa, just 11% of their people are double dosed. Within Europe, Germany is struggling. In the last 24 hours, they reported more than 260,000 cases. 260,000 cases in a day, their highest daily caseload since the pandemic began. What's worse, this could be an undercount. Experts say Germany's testing centers have reached full capacity. If they extend that capacity, more cases could emerge. Now, those are the numbers. But what is driving those numbers? A premature declaration of victory. Europe started it. Their leaders talked about living with COVID. On the 27th of January, Britain lifted all restrictions. Nightclubs, bars, restaurants, everything was reopened. Plus, masks were no longer compulsory. Britain was followed by Denmark, the Netherlands, France, and last month, Germany. They lifted all pandemic controls. It was a 50-50 call. Naturally, the cases were going to rise. Having said that, the world is desperate for normalcy. Endless lockdowns are not an option anymore. What is the WHO saying about all of this? They say this outbreak is just a start. They're calling it the tip of the iceberg.
These increases are occurring despite reductions in testing in some countries, which means the cases we're seeing are just the tip of the iceberg. And we know that when cases increase, so do deaths. Each country is facing a different situation with different challenges, but the pandemic is not over. I repeat, the pandemic is not over.
Dr. Tedros says the pandemic is not over. The global vaccination rate is under 60%. The virus is still mutating. So the pandemic is not over, he's right. Having said that, his own agency is responsible for this misconception. Last week, WHO experts convened a special meeting. Guess what was on the agenda? Not pandemic control, not vaccination. WHO was discussing how and when to declare the pandemic over. I have their statement. Let me quote from what they said. The International Health Regulations Emergency Committee on COVID-19 is looking at the criteria needed to declare the public health emergency of international concern as terminated. Now, to be fair, they did not say when. But in such tough times, nuances get ignored. People are desperately looking for some good news. So they latch on to anything they hear, which is why messaging is so very important. You hear leaders saying things like, live with COVID or cease fire against the pandemic. Those are populist slogans, not an excuse to let your guard down. So far, this new wave has resembled the one in 2020. First China, then Southeast Asia, then Europe. And going by this trend, America and India could be next. In the US, experts are tracking wastewater samples. Now, this is one way of predicting the next wave, wastewater samples. If you find virus traces in wastewater, chances are the next wave is imminent. So what have the Americans found? What do the samples in the US show? A 38% rise in Wuhan virus traces. What about India? Well, these are the numbers published today. Around 2,500 new cases were added in the last 24 hours, plus 60 deaths. At first glance, the outbreak is under control in India. But we know how this virus works. Things can change overnight. Several models are projecting a fourth wave in India. When will this wave hit? Experts say around the month of June. That leaves around 2 months to get ahead of the virus. Last week, Prime Minister Narendra Modi convened a meeting to review pandemic control. This week, the Health Ministry of India has sounded an alert. They're focusing on 3 things: extreme vigilance, aggressive genome sequencing, and intensive surveillance. And all of these are welcome steps. But what about preventive measures? Take schools, for instance. Across India, children are heading back to classes, nurseries, high schools, everything is reopening. But how safe are these children? For starters, they're not vaccinated. Only children above the age of 12 are eligible for vaccines in India, and that too, the process has just started. What about the rest of them? 26% of India's population is less than 14 years old. That's around 31 crore children. 31 crore children. A majority of them are not eligible for vaccines. And starting next month or later this month, they will be in school. Secondly, schools are not fit for social distancing. We all know this. Children will inevitably mingle. They will share pencils or books or sit close to their friends, and you can't blame them for that. I know that resuming classes is an important milestone, a big victory against the pandemic, but that victory cannot be a gamble. Children need vaccines before they return to school. If not, it's a new wave waiting to happen. I know it's a tough call for the government. On one side, the education of millions of children. On the other, the risk of an outbreak. But surely health outweighs everything else. Plus, this is year 3 of the pandemic. We should have better remote learning facilities by now, more technology, more grassroots campaigns, more digital penetration. And schools are just one example. If we want to really live with COVID, as they say, we need to be better prepared. More vaccines, more testing capacity, basically more innovative pandemic control measures. Going back to 2020 is not an option. Lockdowns and flight bans are not an option. Adapting is the new name of the game. It's day 22 of the war in Ukraine, and the fighting is only intensifying. Take a look at these images first. What you just saw were images from a war hospital in Mariupol. Ukraine security forces were trying to shift an injured man. They came under attack. In fact, hundreds of civilians came under fire in Mariupol today. They took shelter inside a theater. Then the theater was struck by missiles. And this is becoming a bit of a pattern. Bombing has intensified in all major cities. Let me show you what happened in Kiev today. Another apartment block was hit. 1 person died, 3 were injured. Ukraine's army issued a fresh assessment. It says Russia's ground offensive has stalled and aerial bombings have picked up. And you don't have to be a military expert to know this. It's obvious. Bombs are falling left, right and center. At the same time, talks are on too. Talks between Ukraine and Russia. Today, Ukraine drew a red line for the Russian negotiators. This is what reports say. Kiev will not accept any changes to its recognized borders. Ukraine's international border with Russia was demarcated in 1991. That's after the Soviet Union collapsed. And this is the border that Ukraine is talking about. Kiev wants Moscow to respect those boundaries, the 1991 borders. In other words, Ukraine is trying to play hardball on Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk. Easier said than done. Ukraine is in no position to play hardball. It needs more leverage. So its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, addressed the German parliament today. He made two demands from Berlin: more aid and assistance, and Ukraine's entry into the European Union.
When we asked for preventive sanctions, we appealed to Europe. We appealed to many countries. We turned to you. Sanctions for the aggressor to feel that you are a force. We saw D-Days. We felt resistance. We understood that you want to continue the economy. And now the trade routes between you and the country that has once again brought a brutal war to Europe are barbed wire over the wall, over the new wall that divides Europe.
Strong words from Zelensky. He's been parliament hopping, you see, addressing one Western parliament after another. To what end? A lot of applause and little else. But he did register a win at the ICJ, that's the International Court of Justice. It has ruled in favor of Ukraine and against Russia. Remember, Kiev had moved the ICJ soon after the invasion. The hearing began. Russia refused to send a representative. What was Ukraine's case? Ukraine wanted an end to the Russian offensive. And for whatever it's worth, the court ruled in its favor. Not like the Russians sought the court's permission before attacking. So this ruling is mostly symbolic. And it's not even the headline, frankly. The headline is this: an Indian judge at the ICJ ruled against Russia. Now, there are 15 judges here. 13 of them voted in Ukraine's favor. 2 voted against. The Indian judge was among the 13. His name is Justice Dalveer Bhandari. He was elected as a judge at the ICJ in 2017. And that name may sound familiar. Justice Bhandari was also on the bench for the Kulbhushan Jadhav case. And this time, he's voted against Russia. India has been quick to distance itself from this vote. New Delhi says that Justice Bhandari has voted in his individual capacity and that the vote is not a reflection of India's position. Interesting. That's not how Ukraine sees it. But let me tell you what the court order said before we get to the reactions. The court is profoundly concerned about the use of force by the Russian Federation in Ukraine, which raises very serious issues of international law. The Russian Federation shall immediately suspend military operations that it commenced on February 24, 2022 on the territory of Ukraine. Russia should stop the attack. That's what this court is saying. Russia has rejected the ruling. Ukraine, though, is calling it a big win.
This victory is the victory of the international law and the international law order. And this is the victory for each and every Ukrainian who is now suffering from the Russian aggression. And of course, it is a huge victory for our brave soldiers who are now trying to push Russia back from our territory. And of course, this is the victory in the memory of each and every Ukrainians who died during this aggression. We are very grateful for the court for such a behavior and for such a strong decision.
Strong decision, says Ukraine. Rulings of the ICJ, we must tell you, are binding. But the court has no direct way to enforce them. So on paper, it is a win for Ukraine. But on the ground, this is what the picture looks like. These are satellite images of the devastation in Ukraine. Those pictures make one thing clear. Fighting to the end is not an option. It would devastate Ukraine further. It would kill thousands of citizens. So diplomacy is the way to go. But this is wartime diplomacy. Ukraine is seeking the right to exist. Russia is seeking political commitments. It is not a negotiation between equals. So what options does Volodymyr Zelensky have? Right now, he's betting on more outside support. He's still betting on Western support. Western countries are inviting Zelensky to address their parliament. It's become a ritual. He pops up on the big screen. He asks for a no-fly zone. The lawmakers nod in approval. They gave him a standing ovation and scene. It is scripted to the point of pathetic. Take a look.
Зобов'язує велич вашої держави і вашого народу.
Are lucky to have you as our champion.
Вже робить перший те, до чого згодом приходять інші країни, але ми потребуємо. З яких Росія вже не зможе щодня і щоночі тероризувати наші мирні міста. For your support. Зупиніть війну. Допоможіть нам її зупинити.
Zelensky basically had just one appeal to everyone, a no-fly zone, but every Western leader has ruled it out. Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, Emmanuel Macron, all of them want to cheer from the sidelines. So a no-fly zone is not happening. The West knows that. We know that. Russia knows that. So why is Zelensky still asking for it? Well, we can think of two possibilities. Number one, his political inexperience. Zelensky was hoping for more help from the NATO. He was betting on Western intervention. Perhaps on day 22, he's still hopeful. That explains his emotional appeals to Western parliaments. He's showing them pictures of destruction, of Russian missiles hitting buildings, of Ukrainian refugees fleeing. Zelensky is appealing to NATO's humanity. Unfortunately, such a thing does not exist. So here's possibility number two. Zelensky is more astute than we may think. All these appeals, all these emotional speeches, they're all laying the ground for his final gamble, a deal with Russia. For Zelensky, any deal is a double-edged sword. Yes, the fighting will end, but at what cost? What is Zelensky surrendering for peace? Let's do a comparison. These were Putin's demand in December 2021. Neutrality for Ukraine, meaning no NATO membership. No eastward expansion for NATO. Joe Biden flatly rejected those terms. So did Zelensky. They said no to Russia. Cut to March 2022. And this is what Putin is asking for. Neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO membership meaning, recognition of the two rebel republics in the east, in the Donbas region, and acceptance of Crimea's annexation. So the terms are definitely harsh. Putin is asking for a lot more now than he was last year. But what option does Zelensky have? He can either accept the deal or preside over the total destruction of his country. Simply put, there is no winning here. He's either the president who surrendered or the sitting duck president. But there is a third option. Zelensky could blame NATO for leading him down the war path. And frankly, he wouldn't be wrong. NATO did promise military assistance. They promised to defend Ukraine's sovereignty. But when the time came, they decided to sit it out. So Zelensky would not be wrong in blaming NATO for the way things have played out. The question is what happens after that? Ukraine is devastated by the war. It needs urgent reconstruction. Who is going to pay for that? Putin certainly won't. So Zelensky's best bet is still the West. Perhaps a more seasoned politician would have handled things differently. Perhaps they would have understood Putin's real intention or realized the extent of NATO's support or the lack of it. The fact is, we cannot be sure. Zelensky's immediate priority is a ceasefire, and for that he must make concessions. Neutrality, of course, is non-negotiable. Even Zelensky has realized that. So two questions remain. A, the breakaway republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. And two, security guarantees. Ukraine is open to discussing the future of Donbas, but not today. They want to end the war and then talk politics. Security guarantees is a tougher question. How much is the West's guarantee worth? Does Zelensky trust Western leaders anymore? He's already proposed the idea of Israel as a guarantor. So Zelensky is keeping his options open. This strategy may help him in the short run. But history is long-sighted. It won't remember the selfie videos or the parliament speeches. It will only remember the false Western promises and how a political novice fell for them. At least Zelensky has that excuse. His political career is just 5 years old. Multiply by 10, that is Joe Biden's career for you. 50 years in politics. But all that experience has mattered little. Biden is still stumbling his way through this crisis. Wednesday was another example. Reports asked Joe Biden a simple question, a yes or no question. Reporters asked this question: do you think Vladimir Putin is a war criminal? Listen to what happened next.
Mr. President, after everything we've seen, are you ready to call Putin a war criminal?
No.
Are you ready to meet with Vladimir Putin?
Thank you so much for everything that you do.
You asked me whether I was called.
Criminal, sir.
Oh, I think he is a war criminal.
Will you be meeting with us?
How decisive. Exactly what you want to hear from a wartime leader. Did somebody nudge Biden to change his position there? Did he not hear the question properly? Or is this another classic Biden faux pas? Either way, the White House was forced to clean up. They say Biden was speaking from his heart.
The president's remarks speak for themselves. He was speaking from his heart and speaking from what he's seen on television, which is barbaric actions by a brutal dictator through his invasion of a foreign country.
Let's address the basics first. Who decides whether someone is a war criminal? The United Nations has a court for that. It's called the ICC, the International Criminal Court. It's based in The Hague. This court can label someone a war criminal. Question number 2, what constitutes a war crime? There's no fixed list, but most of the offences are drawn from the Geneva Convention. I'll list some of them out for you. Targeting civilians, targeting non-military assets, using human shields, taking hostages, using banned weapons, all of these are war crimes. Now, looking at this list, Russia is a prime candidate. They have targeted hospitals, schools, shelters, residential complexes have been bombed. Technically, they are war crimes. These are war crimes. Question number 3. Is Putin a war criminal? Vladimir Putin is the president of Russia, which also makes him commander-in-chief of the Russian armed forces. So he does share responsibility. Perhaps he ordered these illegal strikes, or at the very least, he knew about them. So the allegation is certainly warranted. Question number 4, can Putin be prosecuted? Tribunals have prosecuted leaders before, like the Nuremberg trials or the Tokyo trials. But Russia does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction, so Putin is not going to be prosecuted, nor will he send his generals to the stand. So all of these allegations are mostly symbolic, and America should know that. On Tuesday, the US Senate passed a resolution against Putin. What does it say? That Putin is a war criminal, that the ICC must immediately probe his actions in Ukraine. How brave of the senators, except America itself does not recognize The Hague. In fact, they've gone one step ahead. Let me introduce the American Service Members' Protection Act, aka the Hague Invasion Act. It was signed by George Bush in the year 2002. What does this law say? Now listen to this carefully. The APSA authorizes the president to use all means necessary and appropriate to bring about the release of any US or allied personnel being detained or imprisoned by, on behalf of, or at the request of the International Criminal Court. All means necessary, which means anything. This law empowers America to invade The Hague, hence the nickname, the Hague Invasion Act. I'm not saying the US will actually do it, but imagine the audacity. Washington will go to any lengths to protect its war criminals. And by the way, that list is long too. The man who signed this law, George Bush, is one of them. His war on terror killed thousands of innocent civilians. He authorized torture. He illegally detained hundreds of people, but The Hague won't touch him, because if they do, America could invade. The man who succeeded Bush is no better. Barack Obama launched 563 drone strikes. Around 800 civilians were killed in these so-called precision strikes. Again, no accountability. Now, don't get me wrong. None of this justifies what Vladimir Putin is doing. His crimes in Chechnya and Ukraine are equally bad. We're simply pointing out the obvious. A broken system. A system that lets powerful war criminals get away. We cannot let superpowers pick and choose which parts of the international system they like. Just think about it. America and Russia are UN Security Council members. Yet both of them do not recognize the ICC. What's the point of this system? Why? We don't know how this war will end or whether Russia will be held accountable at all. But here's what we do know. The post-World War II system needs to be reformed. If not, more George Bushes will emerge, more Putins will be emboldened, and the world will simply be a mute spectator. For the moment, we shift our focus to the United Kingdom. This week, Iran released 2 British citizens. They were imprisoned in Iran for 6 years. What for? They've been accused of espionage. They were accused of espionage by Tehran. The charges were never proven. But the backstory has emerged now. Reports say the UK government refused to pay over $500 million they owed to Iran, which is why these people were held hostage. Our next report has the details.
Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anousheh Ashuri are back home. For 6 years, they were detained in Iran on charges of espionage. On Thursday, they were finally set free. Why did it take so long? The reason, reports say, was Britain's debt to Iran. The story goes back to the 1970s. A weapons deal between Iran and the UK. London promised the Shah of Iran over 1,000 chieftain tanks. Soon after that, the Iranian Revolution happened. The UK never made the delivery. But they'd taken the money. Iran went to international courts. It wanted its money back. In 2008, the International Chamber of Commerce ruled in Iran's favor. But Britain still refused to pay. It said the international sanctions on Iran made the payment impossible. So how much money are we talking about? $522 million. Iran resorted to taking hostages. It detained the likes of Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe. They were accused of trying to overthrow Iran's government. Zaghari-Ratcliffe was apparently told by her captors that her imprisonment was linked to Britain's debt. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson first denied this link. But last year, former Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt made a claim. He said Iran was using Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe as leverage. The cost of her release was the unpaid debt of $522 million. It came down to Jeremy Hunt's successor Liz Truss to negotiate the release. This time, Britain found a way to pay up.
We have found a way to make the payment in full, in compliance with UK and international sanctions and global counter-terrorism financing and anti-money laundering regulations. A sum of £393.8 million has now been paid, which will only be available for humanitarian purposes.
Finally, Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe and her fellow detainees have been released. They had an emotional reunion with their families at the airport. But the 6-year-long saga has raised more questions. Couldn't the British government have acted sooner? Opposition parties are blaming Boris Johnson. They say the British Prime Minister prolonged the ordeal of the detainees, while Iran seems to have gotten away by indulging in hostage diplomacy. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Our next story is about Sri Lanka. For quite some time now, the island nation has been in the grip of a severe financial crisis. Foreign reserves have been depleting. The currency has been losing its value. Public debt has reached unsustainable levels. Given the state of affairs, the government of Sri Lanka has taken a desperate step. It has decided to seek a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Also, $1 billion line of credit from India. We'll discuss both of them in detail. First, the IMF bailout. On Wednesday evening, the Sri Lankan president announced that his officials are in talks with the IMF regarding the repayment of loan installments and sovereign bonds. Listen to this.
The government is in discussions with various parties to implement a new method regarding this, which will be beneficial to our country. Yesterday's discussion with the International Monetary Fund was also held for this purpose. Through those discussions, we hope to find a way to pay off our annual loan installments, sovereign bonds, and so on.
So how much money will Colombo take from the IMF? We don't know that yet. What we do know is that this decision marks a radical policy shift for the Rajapaksas. For more than a year now, the Rajapaksas have been resisting all calls to seek the IMF's help. Both from international experts and their own policymakers. They've all been asking the government to go to the IMF, but the government kept arguing against this, against asking global financial bodies for help. They said this will come with strings attached and this would hurt Sri Lankan interests. Well, those conditions don't matter anymore. The Rajapaksas have taken a U-turn, and these pictures explain why. The people of Sri Lanka have hit the streets. They're blaming the government for the economic crunch. For the last 2 days, hundreds of them have been protesting outside the Sri Lankan president's office, accusing him of destroying the country's economy and making calls for his resignation.
No medicine in the pharmacy, no cement, no food, no drink, no milk powder to give to the children.
We have come to tell the government that's ruined this country to go home. This is a government that is drunk with power. This is an arrogant government. This is a government that does not feel the pulse of the people. The government does not understand the suffering of the people.
Rajapaksa's decision to go to the IMF is being seen as an outcome of this public anger. But his critics say it's too little too late. They say it won't quell these protests. You see, a bailout from the IMF can only help Sri Lanka repay its debt. It won't be enough for the economy to be brought back on track. It won't be enough to ensure a steady supply of daily essentials. For that, Colombo will have to secure more financial assistance, which, by the way, it's already trying to get. And guess which is the first country to have offered help? India. The government of India has extended a $1 billion credit line to Colombo. The agreement was signed during a visit by the country's finance minister, Basil Rajapaksa. He was in New Delhi today. He met India's finance minister, the foreign minister, even the prime minister. The outcome of these meetings is this: the State Bank of India has signed a pact with the Sri Lankan government, a pact to provide a $1 billion credit line for the supply of essential commodities. This is in addition to the $1.4 billion which India has extended to Colombo just this year. This includes a $400 million currency swap, a $500 million loan deferment, and a $500 million line of credit for fuel imports. Now, India has given another $1 billion in a credit line to Sri Lanka. What does this tell you? That India is going all out to help its neighbor. It's been extending a helping hand to Sri Lanka without debt trapping it. We hope this continuing support makes Colombo realize who its true friends really are and who lay the debt traps. For the moment, we turn to Japan. It has been hit by an earthquake measuring 7.4 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was the coast of Fukushima, the site of the devastating 2011 tsunami. This time, the tremors weren't as lethal, but they've still caused considerable damage all over Japan. Here's a report.
Derailed trains, damaged buildings, cracked highways, and crushed vehicles. This is the aftermath of a 7.4 magnitude earthquake, which hit northeast Japan on Wednesday evening. The epicenter was Fukushima Prefecture. These visuals are from a gaming arcade in Fukushima City, where machines kept shaking for a long period. The tremors were also felt in a host of other Japanese cities. These visuals are from Tokyo. They show buildings rattling soon after the quake struck. In the Miyagi Prefecture, images show the impact on an aquarium store, where water kept sloshing from the tanks for over a minute. In the Nihonmatsu city, amateur footage showed a computer train shaking seemingly endlessly. In Shoroishi, the impact was much worse. This high-speed train got derailed on top of a bridge. 16 of its 17 cars jumped track when the tremor struck. Fortunately, no passengers were harmed.
The Tohoku Shinkansen bullet train was derailed between Shiroishi-Zao Station and Fukushima Station, but there were no injuries and all passengers have been rescued.
The government of Japan is still trying to assess the full scale of damage. So far, they say that 4 people have died and over 100 have been injured. 30,000 homes have been left without power, and 4,300 homes have been left without water. Last we checked, the services were yet to be restored.
The blackout has been resolved in areas under Tokyo Electricity Power Company's jurisdiction. There are approximately 30,000 households still in a blackout in Tohoku Electric Power's jurisdiction, but a majority are expected to be resolved today. As for water supply, Iwate Prefecture, Miyagi Prefecture, Fukushima Prefecture and Saitama have approximately 4,300 homes without water.
This earthquake has also revived memories of a 2011 disaster. It happened in the same area and in the very same month, on the 11th of March 2011. A 9.9 magnitude earthquake in Fukushima had triggered a devastating tsunami. It left over 19,000 people dead. The tsunami also caused nuclear reactor meltdowns, spewing massive radiation which still makes parts of Fukushima uninhabitable. Thursday's tremors struck barely 60 kilometers from the epicenter of this nuclear disaster. Japanese authorities say no abnormalities have been reported at the site, but they have warned people about aftershocks, cautioning that another earthquake can strike at any time.
With that, it's a wrap. We're leaving you with Gravitas Images. Thanks very much for watching.
गया नहीं अभी तक?
गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक। गो मैकेनिक। अरे गया नहीं अभी तक?
गाड़ी की सर्विस कब से ड्यू है यार?
ये थोड़ी जाएंगे कहीं, ये तो गाड़ी की सर्विस करवाने के लिए कहीं जाने की जरूरत नहीं है। चिल, कोई गड़बड़ नहीं है। गो मैकेनिक पर पाए एक्सपर्ट कार सर्विसेज, 50 पॉइंट इंस्पेक्शन और 3 महीने की अनकंडीशनल वारंटी। डाउनलोड करें इंडिया का नंबर 1 कार सर्विसेज ऐप गो मैकेनिक। गो मैकेनिक।
Israel claims to have destroyed a rocket launching site used by the Hamas.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made no mention of any halt to the offensive.
We at WION have tracked this story from the word go.
WION reports on the latest health threat before the world.
People diagnosed with the coronavirus in Russia may be deported back to their home countries.
The looting started early Saturday.
South Africa is witnessing riots.
Hopping through a Taliban controlled town.
Hours of non-stop live broadcasts. The most extensive coverage. Biggest team of reporters on ground.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched the world's biggest vaccination drive.
India will have nearly 120 million doses.
We know that our shared planet is changing for the worse.
We need constructive dialogue. It's time, it's time, it's time.
Protests like these are now a frequent
A friendship that has stood the test of time, dehyphenating geopolitical equation and focusing on bilateral issues.
Place where I'm standing will be the site of the opening battle. As you can see, the reserve forces are getting ready. They're picking up the weapons here.
Ringside, Ukrainian military drills. The Ukraine conflict is intensifying. WION brings you all sides of the story.
The reserve forces are
One of the many protest marches.
Joe Biden, now the 46th president of the United States, has a full plate in front of him.
Afghanistan has been the heart of American military power.
In a clear warning to China, India's military has now taken control of the country for 1 year.
It says that it's likely to miss by that.
What was happening inside the virology lab in Wuhan?
One ship was able to freeze global trade.
We want love, we want peace, we want equality!
A traditional recipe, and it's really very delicious.